My parents called the police the first time. I assumed, it's all uphill. Everything is great until the tenant is not paying rent or, they have more people than was agreed upon.
Right.
And then what do you do in those situations, right?
Yeah. I had bought a brand new townhome in Oakville. I actually rented it to a realtor, funny enough. I think for a few months he didn't pay me and was quite upset knocking on his door. He called the police on me. Luckily, he did move out.
Absolutely, for sure. Well, you were really lucky they left though.
Welcome to the Beyond the Sale podcast. I'm Cynthia Ostos, a real estate broker and team leader at Revel Realty in Mississauga. My goal with this show is to provide you with insights, tactics, and strategies to go beyond the sale. Welcome to Beyond the Sale podcast. My name is Cynthia Ostos, broker and team leader with Revel Realty, and I'm super excited to be launching this podcast. This is our first episode of Beyond the Sale, and I'm here with my amazing teammate, Anita Fervaha. So I just want to welcome you to this first episode. I'm so excited. Thank you. And I'm so excited that you're here with me because it's awesome to have you by my side, and I'm rambling on. So
thank you so much, Cynthia. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. So today our topic is going to be discussing what it's like to be a landlord in 2023. You're a landlord and I'm also a landlord. I've been a landlord for a long time, but I think you've been sort of in the real estate landlord space longer than I've been. So why don't we start with that? I know you mentioned back in the day that you were helping your parents with some of their rental properties.
Yeah, sure. So while I've been a landlord more recently, growing up, renting was a part of our family circle. So my parents, being immigrants to the country, saving up all their funds, they bought their first property. And then we moved probably when I was in about grade 4 or 5. And when they moved, they decided to rent their house out. So the first time they were going to be landlords. And I'm the eldest of 5 kids. And so parents turned to me a lot in terms of advice or how to navigate the landlord relationship. And I helped them to find tenants, taxes, and so forth. But back then, really the laws and the forms and things like that didn't really exist.
Yeah, I was literally just going to ask you as you were saying that, because obviously we know how involved it is to be a landlord, the whole process nowadays. But back then, did you do research? How did you know? Was there a Residential Tenancies Act? I'm sure there was something.
There probably was, but no research was done in that at all. So I remembered them putting ads, hard copy ads.
In the newspaper.
In newspapers, on mailboxes.
Wow.
Because someone in that neighborhood would likely be looking for a place to rent.
Got it.
And that's really, and then we had one interaction meeting with the tenants and they moved in. And so from, I guess, that perspective, it was oh, wow, my parents are getting money from someone else to live in their space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And did you actually vet the tenants yourselves?
So I helped them because my parents, English was not their first language. So I was involved in those conversations and then just helping them with taxes, right? Because then you have to report that income and understanding what that meant and explaining it to them.
Wow, that's intense, Anita.
So we purchased our next home, my parents, we moved in and they finished the basement and then rented out the basement because it was extra income again coming in. And I would say things for the most part were great.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you because that's the thing as landlords, I'd say 8 or 9 times out of 10, things are great and you do have great tenants. So you
Absolutely.
Sort of experienced something like that.
Yeah, so I assumed, it's all uphill. Everything is great until you're faced with problems. So problems where maybe the tenant is not paying rent or, they have more people in the basement than was agreed upon.
Right.
And then what do you do in those situations, right?
Yeah.
So my parents called the police the first time they dealt with something.
I have a story similar to that myself, where I actually had bought a brand new townhome in Oakville. This was like, I want to say maybe like 10 years ago. And basically, I actually rented it to a realtor, funny enough. And I was like, okay, like I'm a realtor, they're a realtor. It was someone that had a family. And a few months after the family moved in, he messaged me and was like, I can't pay the rent anymore. My wife left me, going through a divorce. And I was like, okay, well, what do you mean you can't pay the rent? So I think for a few months he didn't pay me. And it got to a point where I went and was like quite upset, knocking on his door. He called the police on me. And the police basically said to me that, you can't go there. It's trespassing. So that was a huge eye-opener for me. And I just couldn't believe, like, this is a home that I own. And, like, what do you mean it's trespassing, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it didn't really... Obviously, the police doesn't get involved with these matters normally. Mm-hmm. Yeah, luckily, he did move out, right? Because it was very, very upsetting.
Absolutely. Yeah. For sure. And it's your home, your space. And, you were really lucky they left, though. Because
yes. Oh, yeah, for sure.
In many situations, if they don't leave,
yes,
all of our laws really do favor the tenants here.
And that's sort of one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this, because, in this day and age, the laws, I'd say, overly favor tenants over the landlord, right? And right now it's taking about 8 months or so to evict someone, which I don't think your average landlord does know this. Mm-hmm. And that's why, how big we are on educating clients that are interested in, let's say, buying rental properties about the laws and making sure that they actually read up on the Residential Tenancies Act, because I find in my experience, like most landlords don't even know what it is. And that's shocking to me. I don't know if you feel the same way about that or have, come across that.
100%. I 100% agree with you. I think that, being a landlord, with that comes a lot of responsibility, right? Like you as a landlord should really educate yourself, right? You should know what the laws are. You should really, and you're right. I'd say the average landlord doesn't. And it should also be treated like a business, right? Your rental property, that's a business that you're running. So with that, comes a lot of things that I think are really important, like screening your tenants, right? Making sure that you're doing all those checks and balances. So now I find it's more common for people to want to list their properties on the MLS system. Mm-hmm. So with that, we are helping to vet that, right? So with the reference checks, the credit
and there's so
scores.
Much fraud that happens. Honestly,
Absolutely.
Like the amount of fraud we see, it's crazy. Like people are like T4s, like you name it, employment letters, like it's just, and that's why we use certain programs like on our team to vet people.
Yes.
Because, you really need that extra protection.
You do your due diligence to try to make sure. And that single key program that we use is great because it pulls the credit right from Equifax. And then you can compare it to the report that they've provided you and make sure.
Fraudulent credit reports.
Yes.
And the other thing I was going to say about vetting a tenant with the advent of not that Zoom is like new, but definitely Zoom and programs like that weren't used as much pre-COVID. So now you can actually whether it's a FaceTime call with someone that you're vetting or have a Zoom call with them or an in-person interview. We've been seeing that quite a bit with our clients recently where they want to meet the potential tenant before they say yes. I think that's an awesome thing to do, right? Because if you have an interview with them and you're like, oh, I get, bad vibes, don't move forward, right? I think not enough landlords do that also as part of their screening because it is a long-term relationship in most cases. Like how long of your current, I know you have tenants well, you have multiple rental properties, but let's say your longest term tenant, how long have they been there?
Over 10 years.
A long time, right? So like,
time.
I'm not saying it's a marriage, but 10 years, you're going to, be dealing with this person. Like if you can't stand them, right? Like just talked to someone this morning that was saying like a client that called me and they were like, I just want to sell my place. Like this tenant I have is like constantly a pain in the butt, like about every single issue. Right. And it's gotten to the point that they just want to sell the property because they're just not happy with that relationship. And I also explained, to get a tenant out is very difficult. And normally if someone sells their place with a tenant, like it affects their bottom line and how much they're going to get, right? Like you're going to get less money if you sell with a tenant. Like it's almost guaranteed. Harder to show the place.
Absolutely.
You can't stage, you can't paint, you can't prep it for the market. And that buyer has to take on that risk that the tenant might not leave on closing.
No, absolutely. And with the way the market is right now, and there is inventory on the market, buyers are going to tend to steer towards the properties that don't have tenants, right? And even investors, like as an investor, I would rather purchase a property that's seller owned because then you have the right or the control over how much you're going to charge for rent, right? Because the tenants that are already in the space, they could be bound by rent control, which makes it harder for you to get market value in terms of the rent that you're going to get.
For sure. And the rental increases, like they're so small, like 2.5%.
Yes.
That's what I think the 2024 one is. And like we all know what's happening with interest rates and inflation. So it's like, this is why investors are sort of the first to exit the market because your hands are tied as a landlord with how much you can increase the rent, right? So let's say your interest rate, you bought a rental place a few years ago. Now your interest rate is like 2 or 3 times what it was. You're coming up for renewal. Your condo fees or property taxes have gone up, but you can only increase the rent by like 2.5%, which is like nothing. Unless you, of course, apply for an over the limit increase, which I don't know if you've ever done that or.
No, and it's really difficult. It can only be a 3% increase. Many investors are now cash flowing negative and it's hard. It's hard to make the numbers work. So definitely like all things to consider. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, right? It's all about someone else is going to pay my mortgage and I'm a landlord without understanding really what it could mean.
Yeah. And honestly, the landlord and tenant board, they really don't feel bad for landlords, right? Like they're thinking, well, you're in a great position. Like you own a property outside of maybe, your principal residence or multiple. So that's why, they really don't side with the landlord or feel bad if someone isn't paying the rent. Like, it's quite interesting now. All the hearings are done over Zoom online, which I had no idea. Like I had gone in person to one of these trials with an elderly client that I had at the time. She had a nightmare tenant. This tenant was just like not paying the rent, all kinds of people moving in, pets, you name it. And we were trying to sell. It was so difficult. So I had to go and testify at the tribunal. And the amount of cases and things that I saw there, like I literally could not believe it. So I think it's also super important to, if you're going to be a landlord and you want to educate yourself, watch some of these trials on Zoom, right? Like see what are the cases being brought before the landlord and tenant board. And this is also why I think, the government stepped in 2017 because there was so much misinformation about being a landlord, like that standardized guide, the Ontario, what's it called?
Standard lease
The standard
form?
lease form. Thank you.
Yes.
That didn't exist, right? So, and now they have it in all the languages. It's in black and white. It outlines what you can do, what you can't do, what the laws are, because people just didn't know, right? So I think it's just a matter of educating yourself, right? Whether you're a tenant or a landlord.
Absolutely. One situation, I have a home that I rent and the tenants, our original lease was with a couple and their one child. And over time, it started to grow. All of a sudden, there was a fiance and another family member. And, that was not what we originally had agreed upon. And it's really hard to take that to the Labor Relations Board or to wait years for that to happen. So in this situation, I tried negotiating with the tenants myself, and we came up with an arrangement where they will pay us, an X amount more per month. So it worked out. But again, documenting that and having them sign another lease is important, right? It's important to, I think, as a landlord, to make sure you document everything. So if your tenant is not paying rent, document it. If you've ask them, try to work with them, document that. Because if you do go to Labor Relations Board,
you mean the
landlord tenant board, you need to have that documentation. You need to show that you as a landlord,
100%. They want to see that. They want to see the evidence, the proof. So I'd say even if you have a phone call, recap it in an email, like as per our call
absolutely
earlier. I know it's kind of crazy, but this is, if things go south, you've at least got proof, because they look at text messages, like they want to see it all, emails, like
absolutely
all the evidence, right? To make a decision based on, who's in the right and who should move out. But it's just crazy to think 8 months to get someone out. And the other thing I wanted to chat about was cash for keys, right? So I have a close friend of mine that's, dealing with this or dealt with this, where she sold her house and basically the tenant said that they didn't want to leave. And it's sort of extortion, right? Like they wouldn't leave and they kept asking for more and more money to move out, or they said, we're not moving out on closing. So she had to give, I think it was like almost $20,000 to get these people to leave, because she knew that otherwise the buyers would walk away. And don't you think that's sort of like extortion in a way? Like, it's not like a set amount of money. It's whatever you negotiate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that tactic, I think it can be helpful, or at least a measure to explore if you really are in a position where you need to get the tenants out, right? So sometimes, like if you maybe offer 2 months rent, in that case, 20 grand, that's a lot of money. But sometimes, like even just with 10,000, 2 months of rent, at least if they're willing to leave, it is an avenue to explore as a landlord. And I think not a lot of people know about it. They say it's about like
what's fair is about 3 months.
Yes.
Because either way, like the way the law is now, you need to pay 1 month anyways if you ask them to move out, if you sell it or you want to move in. About 3 months is what they're saying.
So I had amazing tenants. And one of the things I thought about was, okay, these people are paying my mortgage, right? I want to have the best relationship I can have with them. So it was the small things I felt like this couple appreciated. Like every Christmas, I would give them a Christmas card and drop off some wine.
We think the same way. I've done the same with my tenants, and it goes a long way.
It goes
because you are so grateful, right? Yes. Especially if you've got a good tenant, paying on time, they're not destroying your place, like
absolutely. So I wanted to maintain that, right? And I think once or twice they asked me for a day or two for rent due to whatever X situation. And I honored that, gave it to them. But then, just having those touch bases. I wish them happy birthday on their birthdays.
Oh, that's really nice.
And I felt like that went a long way. Like we had such a good relationship. And then when they were ready to move on, I helped them find a new place and, now have new tenants in. But I think sometimes as landlords, we forget that as well, that the tenants are people as well.
Sure.
And they are, paying your rent, paying your mortgage at the end of the day. So to try to do things to keep that relationship as strong as you can as well.
No, 100%. That's really important, like anything in life, right? And like I said, some of these people, like, I don't know if everybody knows, but tenancies in Ontario, they don't end. It's right in the standardized lease, right? So the person can literally be there for like the next 15 years. So it's definitely a relationship that you want to make sure is a good and positive one. One other thing I was thinking about, Anita, is that the newer condos, like I know that you've bought some pre-constructions that are closing soon. These are the buildings, I think is it 2018?
Yes.
If it's a condo newer than 2018, there is no rent control. So that's something to maybe think of when you're buying a resale condo as well, right? Like
absolutely.
To get around that.
Yeah. So any property built before November 2018, it's bound by rent control, which, as we mentioned, usually is in and around the 2.5% range, unless the tenant voluntarily vacates the space. Then you, as a landlord, can rent.
That's a happy day for a landlord.
That's the goal,
to get that email or that text, especially if someone's paying like way less market rent.
Absolutely. I think the ideal is, if someone leaves within the 2-year mark, then you as a landlord have that freedom. Because even in the newer buildings, I think, rents have gone up just such high amounts in the last couple of years.
I think over last year, rents are up like 9 or 11%, something like that.
I saw that. I read the 11% as well. So if you have a tenant in your space, even if it's a newer building, would you increase rent 11%? And is that something they're going to agree upon? So sometimes that
was another reason that they introduced the Fair Housing Act in 2017. And that was when people were really complaining about their landlords being like, hey, your rent is going up by 500, by 1,000, right? Like, and then they implemented that. And obviously now it's not something that applies to these newer buildings. So that's going to be interesting to see. Like maybe they'll change it in a few years to include those buildings. God knows what the government has up their sleeves, right? But it's definitely interesting times in Ontario to be a landlord. By the way, Anita, I was just thinking there's been something that just came up in the news, and I think it's really interesting because, again, the government just keeps trying to implement new things, whether it's programs or regulations, like the vacant tax for a lot of people that now, if their place isn't rented out or sold, government says you got to pay tax. So now with Airbnbs, they were saying in the news just the other day that now that income, the expenses, you as an owner of an Airbnb, you can't write off expenses. I don't know if you heard that, but I just think it's crazy because now, like, let's say you own an Airbnb. I know the city of Toronto specifically implemented all kinds of different rules and things that you like hoops that you got to jump through to actually register your Airbnb if you're going to be renting it for, I think, more than 6 months. So now also you're going to have more investors, I feel like, wanting to not be landlords anymore on top of all the other things that you have to deal with. Like,
that's huge because expenses at the end of the day, that's what really brings you.
It offsets things.
And when it comes time for taxes, that's really crucial and important. So I don't know if those Airbnbs now are going to, switch to short-term furnished rentals or how they're going to change that, because that's huge if you can't.
For sure. And then if you do like the long-term lease route, if you go that route, I mean, most times you're going to get less money.
Absolutely.
For example, a security deposit, like people still don't know that you can't, it's actually illegal. You can, I don't know if everyone knows that, but a key deposit is allowed. And obviously, nothing else outside of that. And I find like a lot of landlords still don't know that. They want us to put in like, damage deposits, not legal.
Yes, that's one that I see time and time again, because according to the law, a landlord can only ask for first and last month's rent, and those deposits can only be used for the rent.
Yeah.
So if a tenant damages the property, the landlord cannot withhold that last month's rent.
I know, but people don't know this.
Yes. Yeah. So definitely. And I think that is one of the most, the misconceptions. And the key deposit you mentioned, it's supposed to cover the cost of the keys,
replacing the key, for sure.
Exactly. And anything outside of that can't be in the lease agreement. So if a tenant, though, does damage the property, it is the tenant's responsibility to pay for that. And if they don't, well, then the landlord can go and...
Good luck with the landlord and tenant board. That's going to take you a long time.
A year.
And sometimes it's not even worth it. So it's intense for sure.
So there's definitely a lot of challenges with being a landlord as well. It's not all fun and games, but it is something that I think right back to where we started. The important thing is that you as a landlord are educated. You know what the laws state, and you reach out for support as well.
For sure, 100%. The key is education, right? Because it's not just about putting a tenant in there and then just never talking to them again, right? So it's building that relationship and making sure that everything is, done above board, right?
Yeah.
So
just one other thing I wanted to mention, and I find most landlords don't, but it's you should go and visit your property.
Oh, 100%.
At least once
That's such
a year.
A great point.
And, you give your 24-hour notice, but go in. It's your property. It's your space. You want to know what it looks like inside, 100%. How they're maintaining it. And I would say the average landlord
does not do that. Yeah. That's for sure, 100%. It's definitely something, I don't know if people maybe they don't find the time, or I think it's very important to do that, because that's really the only way you know what's happening in there, right? Like, how does it look? It's really important to stay on top of that. So thanks for bringing that up. That's a great point, Anita.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching episode 1 of Beyond the Sale podcast. We hope you got a ton of value from that. I would say, one of the most important things that we talked about today was really to educate yourself. And if you want to be a landlord, watch some of these trials on Zoom. It is intense, and you will learn so much and really know what you're getting yourself into. Anita, I don't know if you have any last words, or...
I think just the key is educate yourself and know what's involved, right? Like really have an in-depth feel for what it means to be a landlord. And but thank you so much for having me, Cynthia.
Thank you.